Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, Chapter 19. After the departure of Seth, life at the farm settled down and became normal again, at least as normal as it ever was, and Flora was quite glad to have a rest after the strenuous weeks during which she had drilled Elfine and the series of shocks which had resulted in the whisking of Seth and Amos away from Cold Comfort. The first of May brought a burst of summer weather. All the trees and hedges came into full leaf overnight, and from behind the ladder in the evening, cries could be heard of, "Nay, don't 'ee, Jem, and nay, never do that, soul," from village maidens who were being seduced. At the farm, life burgeoned and was quick. A thick, shameless cooing was laid down, stroke on stroke through the warm air, from the throats of the wood pigeons, until the very atmosphere seemed covered with a rich patina of love. The strident note of the cockerel shot up into the sunshine and wavered there, ending in a little feather tuft of notes. Big business bellowed triumphantly in the great field. Daisies opened in sly lust to the sun rays, and rain spears and eft flies, locked in a blind embrace, spun radiantly through the gluttonous light of their ordained death. Mrs. Beadle appeared in a cotton dress, well skewered up at the neck by a brooch with Carrie engraved on it. Flora wore green linen and a shady hat. The first rays of May fell into the room where Judith lay on her bed in silence and were withered. The sordid flies, intent on their own selfish pleasure, buzzed in idiotic circles above her head, with as much noise and as little meaning as life itself, and their sound drew a web of scarlet pain into her withdrawn darkness. She had veiled each of the 200 photographs of Seth, the little black crepe curtain. This done, what else did life hold? The flies buzzed in answer above the dirty water, standing in the wash basin in which floated a solitary black hair. It, too, was like life, and as meaningless. The old woman kept her room also, seated before the fire that danced palely in the thick, coarse sunlight and muttering at intervals. Flares of hate lit her darkness. She sensed the insolence of summer beating on the window panes and wooing away, with its promises, all the Starkadders from Cold Comfort. Where was Amos? The sunlight answered. Where was Elfine? The ringdoves crooned in reply. Where, last blow of agony, was Seth? She did not even know where he had gone or why. Mrs. Beadle said he had gone on them their talkies. What was a talkie? Was Mrs. Beadle mad? Were they all mad? All except you, who sat on here alone, in the old crumbling tower of your body, and Irk, a Starkadder, saying he was going to marry the paid slut. Miriam, who openly defying you when you forbade him, and jingling 3 and 6pence in his pocket, which he had earned by selling water vole skins to a furrier in Godmere. The room was your citadel. Outside, the world you had built up so fiercely for 20 years was crumbling into fantastic ruin. It was she, Robert Post's child. The wrong done to him had come back to roost. Curses like rookses come home to rest in bosoms and barnses. She had poured poison into the ears of your family and sent them out into the world, leaving you alone. They would all go, Judith, Micah, Ezra, Harkaway, Caraway, Luke, and Mark, and Adam Lambsbreath. Then, when they had all gone, you would be alone, at last, alone in the woodshed. Flora was having quite a nice time. It was now the second week of May, and the weather was still superb. Reuben was now looked upon by everyone as the owner of Cold Comfort, and had at once, much to Flora's pleasure, set about making improvements in it, and had asked her to go with him, and had asked her if she would go into the Godmere with him, and help him choose fertilizers and new grinders and what-not. Flora told him she did not know anything about grinders, but that she would try anything once, so accordingly they drove off together one Wednesday morning, in the buggy, armed with a copy of the Internationally Progressive Farmer's Guide and Helpmeet, which Flora had ordered from London, where it was printed by some Russian friends of hers living in West Kensington. "Where did you get the money to buy all these lovely grinders, Reuben?" Flora asked as they sat at lunch in the coffee room of the Lord of Beats after a busy morning shopping. Stolen, replied Reuben simply. Who from? Asked Flora, who was bored by having to pretend to be shocked at things and really wanted to know. Grandmother. Oh, I say, what a sound scheme. But how did you get hold of it? I mean, did you have to get it out of her stocking or something? Nay, I falsified the chicken book. And when we sold a dozen eggs, I writes down we sells 2 eggs, see? I've been doing that for nigh 5 years. I had me eye on them grinders for 5 years, so I plans it all out, see? My dear, I think you're masterly, said Flora. Quite masterly. If you only keep on as you've begun, you will make the farm too prosperous. Aye, if the old devil don't change his mind and come back, said Reuben doubtfully. Happen he may think America's a long way off. Too fur for an old un like him to go, eh? Oh, I'm sure he won't, said Flora decidedly. He seems to be, main set on the idea. She produced from her handbag, for the 10th time that morning, a postcard showing Liverpool Cathedral. It said, Praise the Lord. I go to spread the Lord's word among the heathen Americans. With Rev. Elderberry Shift Glass in Chicago. Praise the Lord. Tell Reuben he can have the old place. Send clean socks. Love to all except Micah, a Starkadder. Oh, I am sure he means it, repeated Flora. It is a pity he says the old place instead of the farm. But if any question ever arises, we can always do a spot of forgery and write in the farm instead. I wouldn't worry if I were you. So they finished their apple tart in leisurely comfort. Just as he was lifting the last spoonful to his lips, Reuben halted with it in the air and said, looking across at Flora, I don't suppose he would marry me, Cousin Flora. Flora was much moved. She had grown to like Reuben in the last fortnight. He was worth whole sackfuls of the other male Starkadders. He was really very nice and kind too, and ready to learn from anyone who would help him to improve the condition of the farm. He had never forgotten that it was she who suggested to Amos that he should go off on the preaching tour, a move which had resulted after Reuben himself had worked on his father's feelings to take Flora's advice in Reuben getting possession of the farm, and he was deeply grateful. She put out her hand across the table. Wonderingly, Reuben took it in his and stared down at it, while the spoonful of apple tart wavered to and fro in his other hand. Oh, Reuben, that is nice of you, but I'm afraid it would never do, you know. Think a moment. I'm not at all the kind of person to make a good wife for a farmer. I like your pretty ways, said Reuben gruffly. That's charming of you. I like yours too, but honestly it wouldn't do. I think somebody like Mark Delar's Nancy would be much nicer for you, and more useful too. She am not 15 yet. All the better. In 3 years the farm will be doing really well, and you will have a really nice home to offer her. Flora's heart faltered as she thought of what Aunt Ada Doom might have to say to such a marriage, but she was beginning to feel a way towards a plan of coping with that old incubus. In 3 years, who knows? Aunt Ada might have left the farm. Reuben reflected, still staring down at Flora's hand. Aye, he said slowly at last. Maybe I'd best have Mark Delar's Nancy. My chickens have been keeping her dolls in feathers for their rats these last 2 years. Reckon it's only right she should have the chickens too in the end. And he released Flora's hand and finished his spoonful of apple tart. He did not seem at all offended or hurt, and they drove home together afterwards in comfortable silence. Elfine's visit to the hawk monitors had been extended for a further week, and Flora had twice been over there for tea. Mrs. Hawk Monitor seemed quite won over by Elfine, much to Flora's relief, and described her to Flora as a dear little thing, rather brainy, but quite a nice little thing. Flora congratulated Elfine in private, and warned her not to talk quite so much about Marie Lawrenson and Purcell. The end was achieved. There was no point in overdoing it. The wedding was fixed for the 14th of June. Mrs. Hawk Monitor had decided that it should take place in the church at Howling, which was a beauty. She then stunned Flora by suggesting that the reception should be held at Cold Comfort. So much more convenient than coming all the way back here, don't you think? Oh, I say, said Flora, pulling herself together in response to an agonized glance from Elfine. I rather doubt if that would do, you know. I mean, old Mrs. Starkadder is a bit of an invalid, and what not. The, noise might upset her. She need not come down. A tray of cake can be taken up to her in her room. Yes, I think that would certainly be the best thing to do. Is there a large room at the farmhouse, Miss Post? Several, said Flora, thinking about them. Splendid, just the thing. I will ride to old Mrs. Starkadder tonight, said Mrs. Hawkmonitor, who was rather wanting to shift some of the botheration of the wedding onto Elfine's family, vaguely but effectively changing the subject. So there was a new horror on the horizon. Really, thought Flora, riding home in state in the giant Hawkmonitor Renault. There was no end to her worries. She was beginning to think she would never get the farm tidied up in her lifetime. No sooner did she get one person comfortably fixed up than somebody else began to tear up the turf about something, and she had to begin all over again. It was true, though, that matters were better since Reuben had taken up the position of owner of the farm. Wages were paid regularly, rooms were swept out occasionally, nay, they were even scrubbed, and though the bi-weekly inspection of the books by Aunt Ada Doom still went on, Reuben had started another set of books of his own in which he put down the farm's real takings. The books which Aunt Ada saw twice a week were cooked like old Harry. Aunt Ada had not been downstairs since the night of the counting, and Micah, Ezra, and the other Starkadders had taken advantage of her temporary setback. They had also been encouraged by the getaway of Seth, Elfine, and Amos. They realized that Aunt Ada, like the rest of us, was only human. So they commanded Prue, Letty, Jane, Phoebe, and Susan to say nothing of Rennet, to come up to Cold Comfort from the village and establish themselves in their possessions in some of the empty rooms of the farmhouse, as far away from possible from Aunt Ada's chamber. And there they were, all living like fighting cocks, and wherever Flora went she seemed to stumble over hen-faced female Starkadders in cotton dresses. As for Mrs. Beadle, she said all them old witches fair gave her sick, and she was quite glad to get home to Irk and Miriam and the Watervoles. So on the whole, life at the farmhouse was much pleasanter for the Starkadders than it had ever been before, and they had Flora to thank for it. But Flora was not satisfied. She was thinking, as she was borne homewards in the Hawkmonitor's chariot, how much yet remained to be done at Cold Comfort before she could really say that the farmhouse was in a condition to satisfy the Abbé Fossey-Migri. There was the problem of Judith. There was old Adam, and there was Aunt Ada Doom herself, the greatest problem of all and the hardest. She decided she must tackle Judith next. Judith had been lying in her room with the window shut quite long enough. Twice had Mrs. Beadle asked if she could turn out the room, and twice Flora had been forced to reply that it was not yet convenient. But now, Flora decided, things had gone far enough, and she would beard Judith as soon as she got home. The evening sunlight lay across the corridor in sharp tiger bars as she approached Judith's room. The door was shut. It was like a forbidding hand pressed soft and flat against the silence of the corridor. Flora tapped against it and waited a few seconds for an answer. But there was only the indifferent silence. Oh well, she thought, turning the handle, walked in. Judith was standing at the washstand, rinsing one of the 200 little crepe curtains which hung over the 200 photographs of Seth. Her blank eyes burrowed through the faded air between herself and her visitor. They were without content, hollow pools of meaninglessness. They were not eyes, but voids sunk between two juddering penthouses of bone and two bloodless hummocks of cheek. They suspended two raw rods of grief between their own immobility, like frozen fountains in a bright wintry air, and on these rods the fluttering rags of a futile grief were hung. "Oh, Cousin Judith, would you care to come up to town with me tomorrow?" asked Flora pleasantly. "I want to do some shopping, and I hope to lunch with the very charming Austrian, a Dr. Moodle from Vienna. Do come." Judith's laugh shocked even the careless flies that circled above her head. In a momentary silence, "Ah-ha! I am a dead woman," she said simply. Her hands lay piteously at her sides. "Look, the little curtain was dusty," she murmured. "I had to rinse the dust off it." Flora refrained from pointing out that if you rinsed something that was dusty, you merely made it worse. She said patiently, that she proposed to catch the 10:30 to town, and that she would expect Judith to be ready at 9 o'clock. "I think you will enjoy it, Cousin Judith, when you get there," she urged her. "You mustn't carry on like this, you know. It depresses us all to no end. I mean, all this lovely weather and what not. It's a pity to waste it." "I myself am a waste," said Judith stonily. "I am a used husk, a rind, a skin. What use am I? Now he's gone." "Well, never mind that now," said Flora soothingly. "Just you make up your mind to be ready by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." And before she left her that evening, she managed to gain from Judith a vague half-promise that she would be ready as suggested. Judith did not seem to care what happened to her so long as she was not made to talk, and Flora took advantage of her lassitude to impose her fresh will upon her cousin's flaccid one. After leaving Judith, she sent Adam down to Howling with the following wire: Herr Dr. Adolf Moodle, International Institute Psychoanalysis, Whitehall, SW. Interesting case for you. You can lunch two of us at Grimwald's 1:15 tomorrow, Wednesday. How's the baby? Love, F. Post. At 9 o'clock that night, while she was sitting at the open window of her little parlor, inhaling the fragrance of a May tree, and writing to Charles, a telegraph was delivered to her by Mike Dollar's very Nancy herself, which read: "But of course, delighted. Baby have marked paranoid tendencies. Nurse assures me quite normal at 8 months. She knows much more than I do. Perfect treasure. Looking forward, seeing what you weather, Adolf." And that is the end of chapter 19.